Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 5th of June of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kharkiv direction. As we discussed in the previous videos, according to the Russian intelligence, Russian reconnaissance information, they managed to discover that Ukrainians are planning to begin a Kharkiv counteroffensive operation, not just the Kharkiv counteroffensive, but using significant number of forces as a result that were collected as a result of bloody mobilizations that we can see right now in Ukraine, as a result of, let's say, permissions that Ukrainians receive from the Western countries to start using weapons on the territory of Russian Federation. The Russians expect a very powerful attack. It's not going to be something like attack from Kharkiv till Moscow. This is going to be something like a project, something like a task project that Ukrainians are planning to show, to represent to the Western countries on the summit that are going to take place in Washington, the NATO summit, and Ukrainians will try to show the Western countries that the Ukrainians still have power to attack and that the Western weapon is useful but not useless in the fight with Russia. So we'll see what is going to be next. But when talking about the current situation on the ground, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received almost nothing. We haven't received almost anything from the direction, just few unset strikes, few destroyed artillery systems of armed forces of Ukraine, few destroyed tanks from hidden positions. When talking about the situation on the ground, no attempt to attack neither from the Russian side nor from the Ukrainian side, at least on Liptsi, Glubok, Lukantsy direction. Just the static front line, the clashes between the trenches without any attempts to attack from both sides. When talking about Volchansk, as you can see, we have a lot of geolocations. Most of them took place in the southern part. The Russians continue hunting the Ukrainians, destroying their artillery systems, armored vehicles and tank supply support machine. The Russians control the territory. Of course, the beginning of offensive operation in Kharkiv was unexpected to the Ukrainians. They haven't managed to prepare the supply roads. They haven't managed to prepare anything, and now the Ukrainians are suffering significant losses just during the battle for Volchansk. When talking about Volchansk itself, today the group of forces north, according to their official statement, they managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt in the northern part and to enter the industrial zone in the most southern part. So once again, to summarize report we received from official channel of the northern part, group of forces, the Russians, as a result of attack, entered this, let's say, industrial zone. Currently the clashes are taking place most likely for the western part, and according to the Russians, they managed to establish control over a few buildings. We are adding this, let's say, area softly, but currently something like this is taking place in this part. On the other hand, we start receiving any updates from the Ukrainian side about their counterattacks. They try to control the sky, they try to control the northern part with drones. We see the Russian soldiers who were moving from one building to another very relaxed, without any, let's say, expectation from the Ukrainian side of being attacked. So this is the situation in this area. Now let's move further to the south in direction of Kupyansk. When talking about Kupyansk, we got probably the most interesting report since the beginning of creation of the front line. According to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, as a result of clashes in Kupyansk direction, the Ukrainians lost significant number of forces. According to the numbers they provided, the Ukrainians lost 545 soldiers just during the previous 24 hours. And this is the biggest number ever we received since the beginning of the front line. Usually the level of losses of armed forces of Ukraine varied from 100, from 70 till 200, 300 soldiers, but today we got 545, and the Russians provided significant number of videos confirming the progress all over the line of combat contact, starting from Liman and ending till the central Kupyansk direction. For example, on this video we can see how the Russians were storming another trenches, another tree line in the area. First, the Russians were using personal carriers. They entered the territory, landed the infantry and start clearing the trenches. This event took place in this area, and we see that the Russians are advancing and trying to, let's say, bypass Sinkovka from the east and to get as close as possible to Pershatranova. So this is approximately what the Russians are trying to achieve. Now let's move to Kislovka-Kotlarovka. The Russians currently are focused mainly with artillery and aviation on the village by the name of Stepovo-Novoselka, trying to destroy the Ukrainian positions, the strongholds, to prepare the foothold before further Russian offensive operation. The most important updates are coming from Stelmakha, from this area. We got lots of updates. Let's start from the northern part. Today, the Ukrainian sources published the video of how they were FPV droning the Russian forces in this area. We will not watch the video due to significant number of casualties among the Russian soldiers, but if we summarize everything, the Russians were trying to attack Stelmahovka using this route of attack, trying to advance, and most likely the Russians managed to improve their positions, because currently this is the common situation when the Russians from day to day are improving their positions. I'll remind you that during the beginning of May and the end of April, we got significant number of updates from the Russian side of how they were attacking the Ukrainians in Stelmahovka from the north. Currently, we haven't received any updates regarding the, let's say, to adjust the map, but something like this currently is taking place in this area. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians, after another artillery and FPV drone preparation in the vicinity of Heorhiivka and Avdiivka, also managed to improve their positions, and according to different mappers, according to different, let's say, analytics reports, military experts, the Russians managed to improve their positions like this and to capture additional buildings and additional streets in the village by the name of Rozovka. So as you can see, by this attack, the Russians are trying to secure the southern flank and not to allow the Ukrainians, not to give the Ukrainians opportunities or possibilities to counterattack the Russians from Vishnyovo in this direction before the Russians finish the battle for Stelmahovka itself. So if we summarize everything, every report we receive, currently the Russians managed to establish something like this, and this is already semi-encirclement. As you can see, the Russians are attacking Stelmahovka from the north, the Russians are attacking Stelmahovka from the northeast, from the east, and from the south and the southeast. So significant number of directions. Most likely during the next few days, the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back due to significant losses, due to very big problems with the supply and supporting of this area. And also, I'll remind you that just during the previous few days, we talk a lot that the Russians managed to destroy all bridges in this area through Oskol River. So the Ukrainians suffer significant problem with logistics. And as we discussed as well, that most likely, we talk about this yesterday, during the next few days, we're going to receive significant activity of the Russian forces exactly on this direction. And now we see exactly what we were talking about. The Ukrainians trying to reinforce their positions, trying to stabilize the situation, redeployed significant number of forces in Borovaya. A few months ago, the Ukrainians redeployed the force of 3rd Azov Brigade. Now we got report that the, let's say, epic failures of 67th Brigade were redeployed in this direction as well. I'll remind you that 67th Brigade is brigade that abandoned their position in the eastern Chasiv Yar, which led later to complete collapse of defense belt on this direction. Now let's move further to the south in direction of Siversk. We have significant number of reports. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians conducted a series of attacks in direction of Verkhnykamiansk, trying to establish control over these trenches, over these strongholds. The Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainian sources of 54th and 118th Brigades published the video of how they were repelling the Russian attacks, Russian armored vehicles with a significant number of FPV drones. The Russians were using the turtle tanks, the Russians were using significant number of personal carriers and infantry, but according to this video, most likely that attack was repelled. But when talking about the geolocations, the Russian tanks, the Russian infantry managed to reach this area and were trying to clear the territory. So for now, we don't have, let's say, updates whether the Russians were successful or not. So we will keep this area, at least some part of the trenches, in the gray zone. But the most important updates are coming from the south, from Razdolovka direction. Today, some pro-Russian mappers have adjusted their maps, showing significant progress of the armed forces of Russian Federation. Let's take a look at this area, and according to different Russian mappers, as a result of clashes, the Russians, more precisely the regiment, the forces of 51st Russian Airborne Regiment, managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt and to capture significant territories to the west and the north, to the east and northeast of the village by the name of Razdolovka. So if we summarize the reports we got from that mappers, from the 51st Regiment, the Russians managed to establish control over something like this. Of course, significant progress of the Russian armed forces, and currently, if the situation is confirmed, we can make a conclusion that Ukrainian forces in Razdolovka are already encircled, or at least semi-encircled. So, of course, during the next few days, the Russians will continue trying to improve their positions further to the west. They need to capture additional few strongholds, some rich network of the fortifications, and if the Russians are able to capture this territory, of course, Ukrainians in Razdolovka would be encircled, and they would be forced to fall back. Otherwise, they will be captured or they will stay there forever. But as I understand, the Ukrainians would fall back. Furthermore, we have reports, significant number of reports, even since the beginning of June, of how the Russians were bombing this territory. And now let's wait what is going to be next. Now let's move further to Chasiv Yar. We have some updates, but the most important updates are coming from the line Heorhiivka-Zaliznyantska. At least according to the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, this area was the main area of Russian activity. Maybe the Russians were attacking, maybe the Russians were trying to break through, maybe the Russians were bombing and pummeling the territory, but according to the Minister of Defense, they managed to deal significant damage to the Ukrainians exactly on this direction. Currently, it's very difficult to understand what the Russians were planning. Maybe they were trying to attack the concentration of Ukrainian forces who were trying to concentrate themselves before attack on the Russian positions, trying to slow down the Russian progress in the vicinity of Chasiv Yar, or maybe the Russians were trying to attack, trying to defeat the Ukrainians on Siversk direction. Currently, we don't have enough of information to make proper conclusions. When talking about Chasiv Yar itself, there are very heavy clashes in the northern part. The Russians are bombing the Ukrainians in the northern part of Kalinovka. The Ukrainians are trying to FPV drone the Russian reinforcements that are moving along Lisova Street. So currently the Russians probably managed to stabilize the situation, but the Ukrainians still try to make more and more attempts to counterattack the Russians. When talking about eastern Chasiv Yar, we haven't received anything, just few videos of work of Russian storm aviation, but without any changes on the ground, without any additional progress. Maybe the Russians managed to capture additional buildings, but nobody reported about that. Now we are moving further to Avdiivka direction. We have additional updates. As we discussed, the Russians managed to semi-encircle Sokol from the southeast, from the south as well. The Russians managed to block the same village from the north. So as you can see, the situation is very critical. Most likely during the upcoming days and by the end of the weekend, the Russians will establish complete control over the village. Furthermore, the Russians continue improving their positions along the main road and in the village by the name of Novoalexandrovka. According to different mappers, this is approximately the territory that was captured by the Russians during the previous phases of attack. So we see that Sokol, the days of Sokol are numbered, and most likely the Ukrainians very soon will be forced to fall back further to the west in direction of Yevgeniivka and Voshod. But I'm not sure that the Ukrainians are able to hold these villages very long as well. They will be forced to leave this territory very soon completely. Very interesting details are coming from Yasnobrodovka. We have adjusted the map. Today the Ukrainian sources published the video how they attacked with the Javelin the Russian tank. Most likely the tank was destroyed. This event took place here, which confirms that currently the Russians control the road between Umansk and Itailova completely, and the Russians are moving further to the west, trying to encircle or block the village by the name of Yasnobrodovka from the south and southwest. Most likely this is going to happen very soon, and the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back from this direction as well. But when talking about this territory, we can say that currently there is no way to, let's say, evacuate, because the roads in the fields are under complete Russian control, and if the Ukrainians use this road for evacuation, most likely they will suffer significant losses and will lose up to 80% of their personnel. Now we are moving to the south in direction of Heorhiivka. During the previous 24 hours, a significant number of pro-Russian resources reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians established complete control over the town and reached the first and the eastern outskirts of Maximilianovka. Yet we haven't received even a single geolocation confirming this. Most likely we are going to start receiving them tomorrow or day after, or maybe during the next night, or maybe tomorrow the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation will confirm this information as well. If this is true, this means a complete collapse of Ukrainian defense. Most likely the Russians will try to attack Maximilianovka very fast as well. If you remember, we talked a lot and we paid a lot of attention to the village by the name of Heorhiivka by saying that the last report we received from this direction dated on the 17th of May, so around 3 weeks ago, and we were expecting that the Russians are about to renew their offensive on this direction, and now we understand that during the previous 3 weeks the Russians were regrouping, concentrating additional forces with reinforcements and reserves, and now the Russians launched their greatest offensive operation in Heorhiivka, and as a result of clashes, probably for 1 or 2 days, they managed to establish complete control, and now the Russians mainly are focused on these fields, trying to develop their positions to enter Maximilianovka and to start the greatest battle for Konstantinovka. When talking about Konstantinovka itself, if you remember, we talked yesterday about the Russian attacks from Pobeda to the south, about the Russian attacks to Konstantinovka from the southeast, from Paraskoviivka. We got a lot of videos, we discussed them in details, and of course today we were expecting some updates for some additional videos, geolocations that confirm, let's say, the Russian progress inside of Konstantinovka itself, or at least on the northeastern outskirts like this and so on. But during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything, so that's why we can't adjust the map more in Russian favor. But today we got a very interesting post from 79th Air Assault Brigade. They probably tried, maybe they got an order not to publish any information, but they were so desperate, they were so defeated on this direction, so they decided to publish their own, let's say, opinion from the soldiers on the ground about the current situation in Konstantinovka. The post is very difficult to read, there are a lot of bad words, but if summarize everything, according to the forces of 79th Brigade, who's responsible for the protection of Konstantinovka, Paraskoviivka, who's responsible for this direction, stated that the Russians captured Paraskoviivka completely. Furthermore, the Russians managed to dig in deeper on these suburbs on the outskirts of Konstantinovka, and the Russians began creation the semi-encirclement of the village. So to summarize everything, we got the confirmation, currently just Telegram post confirmation, but from official Telegram channel of 79th Air Assault Brigade, that the Russians, as a result of attack, managed to enter Konstantinovka itself, and the Russians began creation the same encirclement, at least on this direction, and currently the Russians control something like this. So Konstantinovka itself, Paraskoviivka itself. Furthermore, the Russians, as we discussed in the previous updates, are moving, let's say, from Pobeda further to the south in direction to get as close as possible to Konstantinovka from the north, and the Russians are trying to make something like this. And don't forget that during the previous day, we just discussed 5 minutes ago about additional Russian progress in Heorhiivka, where the Russians also moving on this direction, trying to block Antonovka and Katerinovka, or at least to establish more or less fire control over the territory, trying to reduce the reinforcement that Ukrainians still have possibilities to get along this road. But anyway, this road is already under complete fire control, and Ukrainians suffer losses when using this area, these roads for rotation, evacuation, and support. And don't forget about further and additional Russian progress that also took place today on the line of Vadiana, Salotka. So the Russians are trying to get here as well, and this is also can lead to significant problems of armed forces of Ukraine. So the front line continue collapsing, and the Russians are advancing and advancing and advancing. Now let's move to Vuhledar. Right after the situation in Konstantinovka become critical, we start receiving the first videos from this most southwestern part of Vuhledar. On this video we can see the arrival of FAB. As a result of strike, the temporary point was damaged and destroyed. Most likely the Ukrainians suffered some losses, and most likely this is exactly the territory that the Russians are planning to storm at first, and the battle we're going to see most likely very soon. If the Russians are able to dig in deeper in the southwestern part of Vuhledar, then this is going to be, of course, significant progress, and most likely the Russians would not leave this territory, let's say, for nothing. When talking about South Donetsk direction, we haven't received almost anything, just few tall flamethrower strikes. The Russians continue clearing, the Ukrainians continue sending additional reinforcement, but most likely this story is going to be finished very soon. Robotine, we haven't received anything, just the regular activity, also tall flamethrower strikes. We receive every day more and more videos, further and further from Robotine, closer and closer to Heorhiivka, Avdiivka, Novodanilovka. So the Russians are using TOS flamethrower systems. Very soon the Russians are going to start using TOS flamethrower system number 3, type 3, the Dragon, and the distance of this type of weapon is around 15 kilometers. After that, I'm not even sure what the Ukrainians are going to do with this when the Russians are able to attack with this type of weapon within 15 kilometers. The most interesting and unexpected updates are coming from Kherson direction, most likely during the next few weeks. 6, Kherson is going to be, they're going to be very hot on Kherson direction, and the most important video and geolocation we receive is geolocated in the vicinity of the village by the name of Dacha, right in front of Kherson itself. The video was published by the Ukrainian sources. On this video we can see the Russian Marines moving along the village under very heavy rain, and the Russians were trying to get inside of some building. The Ukrainians were hunting them, and at some point the Ukrainians start bombing the Russians with let's say different explosions. This event took place exactly here. The video dated on the 2nd or 3rd of June, which confirms that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, as a result of special operation, managed to restore control over at least some part of Dnieper river right in front of Kherson. Maybe the map you can see right now in front of your screen is not shows not the wrong picture. Very likely that the Russians have a bigger stronghold, better and bigger positions, and who knows, maybe the Russians already control something like this on this side of Antonovsky Bridge, and maybe the Russians restore completely control over this part of Dacha as well. We can't tell for sure. We just got one geolocation, and based on just that geolocation we have adjusted the map, but maybe the Russians have a bigger and better positions here. And the question is why the Russians restore. To tell the truth, this is not very good suitable positions for the Russians because they are located in the lowland, and the Ukrainians have no problems from high-rise building along the east air bank of the river to attack the Russians. But for some reason the Russians restore control. Furthermore, we continue receiving significant number of updates from this part of Dnieper River. The Russians continue bombing and pummeling the Ukrainian positions with different types of weapon, and you know that something tells me about that maybe if the Ukrainians are going to start ever their Kharkiv offensive operation with the use of the Western weapon, who knows, maybe the Russians would try to cross Dnieper River, and maybe the Russians would try to capture these villages like Kizomys, like Yantarne, Beregovo, like Vilentenskaya, because from this perspective, let's speculate a little bit. If the Russians are able to capture this part of Dnieper River, this part of the bank of Dnieper River, it's going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians to counterattack and to force the Russians to fall back, because the villages located along the river, the Russians probably would not have any problems with supply and support, and just with light infantry and FPV and artillery support, the Russians will be able to hold this territory for a very long time. The Russians don't have problems with artillery and FPV drones. The Ukrainians had problems with artillery, so that's why they could support their forces just with FPV drones, but that wasn't so effective. Furthermore, there was a forest behind Krinky, and the Russians were concentrated most of the forest there, so they were invisible for most of Ukrainian, let's say, reconnaissance services. And when talking about this part, there is no forest further to the north, and this is going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians to counterattack due to the specific configuration of the area. So anyway, very interesting, and once again I'll repeat myself, most likely Kherson direction, if the Ukrainians are going to start Kharkiv offensive, most likely Kherson direction is going to be very hot, and very likely the Russians would try to make some attempts to maybe not to restore control over Kherson, because anyway it's going to be very difficult to support the town, but to establish another points of pressure and to break the Ukrainian plans in Kharkiv. This is exactly what the Russians are able to do and will do most likely. Furthermore, when talking about political events, we got significant number of them. The most important that we start receiving the first videos of casualties along the borderlands between Romania and Ukraine. The Ukrainians mine this area with mine Sleepy Stock, which is let's say military crime. Furthermore, the Ukrainians mine the area against their own population, not against the Russians, which maybe can explain this action, but against the regular Ukrainians who just don't want to fight for Ukraine, who just don't want to die somewhere in Kupyansk. But the most important is maybe not the number of casualties, and the most important that Ukrainians these people, after they got in minefields, most likely would survive, but they would not be able to take part in military. So they couldn't escape, and they would not be able to continue, because they will be people with some kind of disabilities, mainly with their legs or something like this. Anyway, terrible situation and terrible things that Ukrainians are doing. Furthermore, we got very important statement and report from the US Embassy in Ukraine. They asked not to go to Ukraine to any people, to anybody from the United States of America who has dual citizenship. So who has the citizenship of the United States of America and Ukraine as well, because all these people would be stopped and all these people would be mobilized and sent to the line of combat contact. Also, the US Embassy provided some kind of instruction what to do in this case. If you are already in the territory of Ukraine and you have dual, let's say, citizenship, you shouldn't leave your apartments. You should call to the US Embassy as soon as possible, and the US Embassy will create a safe evacuation process for you. They will transfer you from your home, from your apartment, using diplomatic roads to the United States of America. So this is the closest ally who published these instructions and this information on the official US Embassy in Ukraine website. Very, very difficult to understand. How can it be possible between Ukraine and the United States of America? But this is Ukraine. Nothing can surprise us recently. And probably that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.